Hello there, thrill seekers, and boy, do I have a thrilling episode for you today. I am going to review a book, but it's not a Zen book. It is called Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallée, UFO Contacts and Cults. And that's what it's about, and it's a real interesting book. This is the old cover. The book originally came out in 1979, I believe. Yeah, so it was written in 78 and came out in 79. It's still in print. The cover that it has now is actually kind of cool, and I like it, but I'm kind of weird, and I like the old-fashioned stuff better, so I searched out, I don't remember where I found this, but I searched out an older copy with the older kind of cheesier cover on it. The new cover is kind of classier. Anyway, Jacques Vallée is a UFO researcher who, to my mind, is the most interesting guy out there talking about the subject. And let me see if I can tell you why, and why I like this book, and what it has to do with the rest of the kind of Zen stuff I talk about on this channel. See if I can stitch that all together, but good luck to me. So most UFO research that's out there falls under the category of the sort of nuts and bolts thing. UFO people sometimes talk about it in those terms. So people who believe in nuts and bolts UFOs are people who believe that UFOs are machines that are made on other planets by beings, roughly like us, might not be exactly like us, but, sort of space astronauts in flying machines that fly here and take a look at us and mutilate cows and do whatever they do and put things up people's bums and whatever. So a good example of a nuts and bolts UFO guy would be Stanton Friedman, who just died a couple of years ago. He was really big into the Roswell thing and proving that alien spacecraft really was recovered by the I don't know if it was called the United States Air Force at the time. I think they were still called the Army Air Corps or something. Anyway, in Roswell, New Mexico, they put out a report saying that we have recovered a crashed UFO. And of course this caused a much bigger sensation, I think, than they anticipated, and they came back, I don't know if it was the next day, but within a few days they came back and said, no, it wasn't anything, it was just a weather balloon. And this, has reverberated for the last 50-odd years, maybe 70 some years. Anyway, so Stanton Friedman was a big proponent of that. Another guy who sort of made the news a couple of years ago went on Joe Rogan. It was Bob Lazar. So Bob Lazar did this Joe Rogan podcast. So if you look up Bob Lazar, Joe Rogan, you can find it, where his claim was that sometime, I think in the 1980s, he was employed by the United States government not at Area 51, which is a secret testing ground for aircraft and such like in the Nevada desert, but in an adjacent area called Area S4. And the one thing that came out of Bob Lazar's revelations is that the United States government finally admitted that, yes, we do have a place called Area 51. They didn't admit that there were aliens there, but Bob Lazar claimed that he had briefly worked there in a project that was intended to reverse engineer recovered alien spacecraft for, getting their technology and whatnot. And so he became really big, and I started watching him kind of closely because I was working on this book about UFOs that I never finished. Maybe I'll finish it one day. But what was interesting is he did the Joe Rogan podcast, which is very long, and there was a movie made about him, a documentary that I think was on Netflix or Hulu or one of those that got a lot of traction, and then he wrote a book. So I watched both of the podcast and the movie, and then I read the book, and then I kind of dug deeper into some of the stuff that he'd put out earlier in the past. He put out like a VHS video, which is now uploaded on YouTube, a much sort of a cheaper version of the same material, the same story, but done much more cheaply. And what was interesting about Bob Lazar is that when you first hear of Bob Lazar's story, it sounds like a nuts and bolts UFO story. Like, here they are, their machines, we're reverse engineering them, I was a scientist, I was working on this, etc., etc. But the more I dug into the Bob Lazar story, the more it started to seem like the kind of thing that Jacques Vallée talks about. And I would love to see Jacques Vallée do an in-depth thing on the Bob Lazar story, although he must be pretty old now and maybe he's not into it, but maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe I'll do the Jacques Vallée version of the Bob Lazar story. But so let's talk about what Jacques Vallée believes, because he doesn't believe that UFOs are necessarily nuts and bolts machines from other planets driven by alien astronauts. He has a very interesting take on it, and I'll just I've cited a few quotes, so I'm just going to run through a few quotes from the book and then maybe talk about them and say what I think about them. A lot of this is about UFO-based cults, but even though it says that on the front, it's the cult stuff maybe makes up 2/3 or a half of the book, and then there's more stuff in there. So it's not entirely about UFO cults. But one of the cults that he examined back in 1978 was the Heaven's Gate. They weren't called Heaven's Gate then, but I don't know if you remember, in the late 90s there was this cult, I think they were in San Diego, and they all killed themselves en masse because they believed that the comet Hale-Bopp was going to come by, and that was actually a UFO, and when they died, their souls were going to go up into this UFO and they would escape mundane reality that way. Well, that was in 1998, I believe, around that time anyway. And Jacques Vallée was looking into them back in the 70s. And this book contains a whole chapter which has the very interesting title, "Why Do They Keep Staring at Walls?" And actually, it doesn't make much sense why it's titled that, but that's the chapter about what became the Heaven's Gate cult before they were even called Heaven's Gate. So the bits I wanted to give you are, here we go. The followers of modern UFO cults are often persons who, like Gregory, well, we don't worry who that is, have become disenchanted with science and technology. Often they're scientists. Often they're people who are really, really deeply into science. Even have PhDs and such like. Scientific reluctance to consider valid claims of paranormal phenomena is slowly driving many people to accept any claim of superior or mystical contact. The voice of science has lied too often. I love that line. A large fraction of the public has tuned it out completely. Yeah, I would say he's right there. The voice of science has lied too often, and I probably shouldn't comment on that or I'll get kicked off of YouTube. Here's a bit of what he believes about UFOs. I believe there is a machinery of mass manipulation behind the UFO phenomenon. It aims at social and political goals by diverting attention from some human problems and by providing a potential release for tensions caused by others. The contactees are a part of that machinery. They are helping to create a new form of belief, an expectation of actual contact among large parts of the public. In turn, this expectation makes millions of people hope for the imminent realization of that age-old dream, salvation from above. Surrender to the greater power of some wise navigators of the cosmos, which is basically what a lot of religions are based on. Christianity is definitely based on that salvation from above. You don't get quite as much of that in Buddhism, although there are some forms of Buddhism that do sort of get into this salvation from above stuff, which one of the things I like about Zen is that it doesn't. Here's another thing about whether it matters if UFOs are real. I have long pondered this question. The answer I have is a disturbing one. We won't worry about the question because the answer is interesting. It can be expressed very simply. It doesn't matter anymore whether flying saucers are real or not. It still matters to me, of course, as an individual scientist. I have often stated, and I still believe today, that UFOs are real and technological. When I say it doesn't matter whether they are real or not, I am speaking of their social impact. You can find scholars who will prove, in quotes, to you that the supernatural powers of Jesus Christ never existed. You can also find scholars who will prove to you that they did exist. Does it matter? Of course not. It only matters to the experts who have staked their academic reputations on either side of the argument. The effects of the belief in Jesus, the impact of the doctrine based on the story of his life and death, are real enough. Socially, historically, the consequences are beyond question. I claim that the same now applies to flying saucers, because enough people believe in them, enough people believe that contact with them is possible, and enough people even believed that they have secretly achieved such contact. So that's an interesting thing, and I've often said that it doesn't really matter that much whether Jesus existed. It doesn't matter that much even if Buddha existed, or Dogen. We're pretty sure Dogen existed in the conventional sense of existence, but it doesn't matter because the impact is there whether or not. And now here's another bit. A lot of people poo-poo UFO stuff because they're so absurd, and I could tell you about some really absurd UFO stories because I like those the best. But here's what Vallée says about this. He says, the way to a man's belief is through confusion and absurdity. The absurdity of many UFO stories and of many religious visions is not a superficial logical mistake. It may be the key to their function. According to Major Murphy, which is the made-up name of an actual ex-military guy that he was talking to during writing this book, the confusion in the UFO mystery may have been put there deliberately to achieve certain results. One of these results has been to keep scientists away. Because it's too absurd and because it can damage a scientist's reputation to examine this stuff. So they make it real absurd so that scientists will be discouraged from examining it because they'll be laughed at. The other is to create the conditions for a new form of social control, a change in man's perception of his place in the universe. Here's another quote I like a lot. The group of people who will first manage to harness the fear of cosmic forces and the emotions surrounding UFO contact to a political purpose will be able to exert incredible spiritual blackmail. Such weapons are less flexible but also less detectable than tanks and aircraft. They represent a more lasting form of control over the lives of men. And he goes on for a whole paragraph that's very interesting about that. And then he says, I don't think we should expect salvation from the sky. I believe there is a very real UFO problem. I have also come to believe that it is being manipulated for political ends, and the data suggest that the manipulators may be human beings with a plan for social control. Such plans have been made before and have succeeded. History shows that having a cosmic mythology as part of such a plan is not always necessary, but it certainly helps. A very interesting little aside there. And my final quote I'll give you, he says something very similar to this in a TED Talk that you can find. So if you look up Jacques Vallée TED Talk, he says kind of a shortened version of what I'm about to read you now. This is about what he thinks the nature of consciousness is. If we consider the physical world to be an associative universe of informational events, consciousness is no longer simply a function which is local to the human brain. Instead, consciousness should be defined as the process by which informational associations are retrieved and traversed. The illusion of time and space would merely be a side effect of consciousness as it traverses associations. In such a theory, apparently paranormal, in quotes, phenomena like remote viewing and precognition would be expected, even common, and the UFOs would lose much of their alien quality. These phenomena would be natural aspects of the reality of human consciousness and would be subject to manipulation by human will, both consciously and unconsciously. So you can see he has a very interesting idea about what UFOs are, and it is informed by a worldview that I assume he must have studied some of Hindu Advaita Vedanta philosophy, which, as I've said, is quite similar to Buddhism, but is different in some respect, but that's maybe a story for another day. And one of the things we do as human beings is we have kind of blinders on in terms of what we can and cannot see or even conceive of being true. So we're very steeped in the materialistic point of view, which we believe has been proven by science. So science says that because independent observers agree on certain phenomenon and measurements and so forth, then therefore there must be an outside world which is solid and reliable and stable. So there is an external world. And Nishijima Roshi was always also adamant that he believed that there was an external world, but his definition of what that external world was a little different from what most people do. But in Buddhism, and certainly more so in Advaita philosophy, but in Buddhism too, the idea is there is just one observer. There aren't independent observers all looking at the same thing and going, okay, we all see the same thing, so we agree it's really there. There's a single observer, and one of the lenses that this great observer, this Inmo that Dogen talks about, one of the lenses that this observer uses to look at reality through is human beings. So human beings all agree on the observations of reality, maybe not because of the reality itself being the single thing that's right here, but the lenses being the same sort of lens is being used to observe this reality. So there could be all sorts of aspects of reality that are not available to our physical senses. That, I think, is probably true. But I also kind of default to the Buddhist standpoint, which is because we are in this place, then this place is what we need to deal with. The thing where I think some of this stuff goes off the rails is when you say that there is another reality that is more important than this one. And the Zen thing, which is why I'm still in Camp Zen, is to say that this reality is what we need to deal with, and the reality we are dealing with is reality, even if we are not perceiving it correctly. So it doesn't mean we have to go somewhere else to find the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is here. It's just our perceptions of it are a little off. Another thing about the belief in power and saviors from the sky, this is the guy who I worked for 15 or more years of my life. I worked for Tsuburaya Productions, who made this show called Ultraman. And Ultraman, I think, is really interesting in terms of the whole UFO thing. I was watching the first episode of the first Ultraman series kind of after or during the time I was reading Messengers of Deception and going, oh my God, this is what this is about. Because the very first episode of Ultraman is an abduction story, is a UFO abduction story, probably, I would assume, inspired in part by the story of Betty and Barney Hill, who were the famous UFO contactees with the first sort of modern-day UFO abduction story. They were a couple who under hypnosis, told a story about going aboard a UFO and being examined and so forth. Well, Ultraman is very much like that. The first episode, this guy gets captured and taken aboard a UFO, and the alien that he sees looks like this, which is very close and very similar to the sort of gray alien of the big-eyed and almost featureless face and gray-colored with, like I said, giant eyes, that Betty and Barney Hill described under hypnosis. So this, and my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, once saw me looking at a book about Ultraman, and he said, oh, those books or those stories, those shows make children believe in power. And I think it is true. It is a kind of a modern day religious mythology that's being developed around UFOs, and that's why I think it kind of dovetails in with my interest in religion and that kind of stuff. And also Jacques Vallée's ideas about what UFOs might be are similarly informed by a worldview that isn't the nuts and bolts worldview, but like I say, probably comes from the Advaita Vedanta tradition, I would assume, although he never references it directly. Anyway, there's my book review of Messengers of Deception. I hope you enjoyed that. Anyway, so if you like that and you want to support what I do, you can go to the URL you're seeing on the screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is where you will find links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts, which are my main ways of making a living these days, so I really appreciate your support for that. But as always, if you don't want to pay, you don't gotta pay, because I'm offering this for free. So we will see you next time on the saucers, maybe. Have a good time all the time. Bye. What are you barking at this time, Ziggy? What? What is it? What you barking at? You see something? Should I know? Is Timmy in the well? Did Timmy fall in the well? No, you don't know who Timmy is. Oh, bye.